proved receptive, appreciative, in fact responsive, might not the ends of justice better be subserved by leaving to the parent the duty of personally and privately correcting the son, and, in consideration of the post commander's wisdom and continence, pledging the influence of the military committee to certain delectable ends in the major's behalf? Long had Flint had his eye on a certain desirable berth in the distant East, at the national capital in fact, but never yet had he found statesman or soldier inclined to further his desire. That night the major bade Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins hold their peace as to Field's peccadilloes until further leave was given them to speak. That night the major, calling at Captain Dade's, was concerned to hear that Mrs. Dade was not at home. Gone over to the hospital with Mrs. Blake and the doctor, was the explanation, and these gentle-hearted women, it seems, were striving to do something to rouse the lad from the slough of despond which had engulfed him. That night Pink Marble, Hay's faithful bookkeeper and clerk for many a year, a one-armed veteran of the Civil War, calling, as was his invariable custom when the trader was absent, to leave the keys of the safe and desks with Mrs. Hay, was surprised to find her in a flood of tears, for which she declined all explanation. Yet the sight of Pete, the half breed, slouching away toward the stables as Marble closed the gate, more than suggested cause, for Pink had long disapproved of that young man. That night Crapaud, the other stableman, had scandalized Jerry Sullivan the barkeeper and old McGann, Webb's Hibernian major domo, by interrupting their game of old sledge with a demand for a quart of whiskey on top of all that he had obviously and surreptitiously been drinking, and by further indulging in furious threats in a sputtering mixture of Dakota French and French Dakota, when summarily kicked out. That night, late as 12 o'clock, Mrs. Ray, aroused by the infantile demands of the fourth of the olive branches, and further disturbed by the suspicious growlings and challenge of old Tonto, Blake's veteran mastiff, peeped from the second-story window and plainly saw two forms in soldier overcoats at the back fence, and wondered what the sentries found about Blake's quarters to require so much attention. Then she became aware of a third form, rifle bearing and slowly pacing the curving line of the bluff. The sentry beyond doubt. Who, then, were these others who had now totally disappeared? She thought to speak of it to Nannie in the morning, and then thought not. There were reasons why nervous alarm of any kind were best averted then from Mrs. Blake. But there came reasons speedily why Mrs. Ray could not forget it. And that night, later still, along toward 4 o'clock, the persistent clicking of the telegraph instrument at the adjutant's office caught the ear of the sentry, who in time stirred up the operator, and a rush message was later thrust into the hand of Major Flint, demolishing a day-old castle in the air. From Rock Creek, Wyoming, October 23, 1880, 9:15 p.m. Commanding Officer, Fort Frayne, via Fort Laramie. Stage capsized Crook Cannon. General Field seriously injured. Have wired Omaha. Signed, Warner, Commanding Camp. End of chapter 16.